Booksy, welcome back to my channel. Today we're here to continue with a review of the previous Man Booker winners. Today we're here with the 1971 winner, In a Free State by V.S. Naipaul, which is a little bit different in its format in that this is not strictly a novel. It is a novella surrounded by a few narratives. The first of the 5 presentations is a journal entry written by an unnamed narrator who is on an overnight ferry in the region of Greece, and there he encounters lots of international travelers. Some of them are Egyptian Greeks who've been forced out of the country because Egypt has just now gotten its independence, it's been liberated, and a lot of the people who went there to take advantage of the opportunities, take advantage of the commerce and the mercantilism, have now been forced to leave whether or not they've made their fortune. And within these few pages, the author renders a portrait of freedom, of what it means to be in search of liberation, to be in search of freedom, the freedom to move around, the freedom to travel, the freedom to explore whatever life you want. But what are some of the consequences? What are some of the side effects? What are some of the things that you give up? And so within this narrative, within this small portrait, we have a tramp who is the person who says that he's probably the most traveled. He's been on the road for a really long time. And the way the author portrays him is that from a distance, he looks like a very sophisticated man, a well-traveled man, a man of substance, a man that you would want to meet. But when he comes closer, he has this Monet-like mess, where from afar, he looked very attractive. But as he approaches, you see that his clothes are very used, very old, very soiled. He probably has a stench. He looks very greasy. And his personal habits are such that you want to keep your distance from him. And there was a lot in this first presentation that makes you think about traveling. The idea that everyone wants to travel, but nobody really wants to leave home in order to do it. And what are some of the things that you have to give up in order to be a traveler? What are some of the things that you give up, and what are some of the things that you gain? We move very quickly into a story about an Indian immigrant, a young man who has been working for an Indian diplomat in India for some time. And even though he has a wife and a family back home, he's been living in the city, he's been living in Bombay with this diplomat. And when his boss gets an opportunity to move to the United States, he at first kind of challenges him to bring him, but then he's not even sure that he wants to go. But eventually, he finds himself in Washington, D.C., and the contrast between his idea of leaving home and what the reality is like, being on board an airplane, finding himself unmoored, finding himself in this new place in Washington where he sees people who look like him, but he has absolutely nothing in common with them, and where he finds that the only thing that is common between his life in Bombay and his life in Washington is that he's still a second-class citizen. He's still sleeping in a cupboard. He's still being taken advantage of. And it's not until he absconds and goes on the lam, becomes an illegal immigrant, that he finds hope, that he finds that he does have some opportunity that he can take advantage of. And it's very interesting how the author portrays this movement, that this Indian immigrant had almost no hope. He was being so taken advantage of when he was following the rules, and it's not until he starts breaking them that he can finally start to make his way in the society. That was very interesting. Then the next narrative is about a West Indian man who is his family is of Asian heritage. You know, during the 20th century, you had a lot of South Asians who moved to the West Indies, some of them as indentured servants, and they established families in the Caribbean and never left. And so in this third story, we have one of those family members. Well, it's an extended family, and we do have the marcation between these two families, one that has gotten educated and their children are also expected to pursue higher education, compared with their other family members where even though they have children and maybe they want to have one that they can send to school, it's almost a hopeless fantasy that they'll be able to do it. But eventually we see these two sons from the two branches of the same family who both leave. They both go to different countries, but they both leave to try to pursue higher education. And the son from the family where that was the expectation, he doesn't do well. Whereas the son from the family that almost had no hope, one goes abroad, and eventually his older brother also follows him to try to take care of him. But there's a lot of complexity within that story. It's a pretty long story. It's called Tell Me Who to Kill, and it follows up on the idea of what a person needs to do to try to protect someone who they love, who is being kind of tossed about in the whole immigration system. So as we follow these two brothers, Deo is the younger brother, and we don't know the name of the older brother, who is the narrator, who's his protector, who is the person who has nominated himself as his younger brother's caretaker. So the narrator moves to England, where he takes these demeaning jobs and is forced to work really long hours, but it's a sacrifice. He doesn't mind doing it because this is his way of supporting his brother's dream. And while it is Deo's dream to become an engineer, it's also the hope of the family. This is the family that was looked down upon by the other branch of their extended family as having no hope. And so supporting his brother's studies, whether moral support or financial contribution, is his way of taking care of the whole family. And eventually, when he realizes that this dream is also still a fantasy no matter what he has done, the reader gets to the narrator's breaking point almost at the same time that the character does, with the realization that no matter what he has done, he has no control over what happens to him or to his brother in this country. And it's a very moving experience, even though you don't always feel as connected to the character. You don't always feel like you can justify what he has done, but you also feel like you understand why he's done it. And then of course we move to the main story, the title story, In a Free State, which is the story that was awarded the Booker Prize, I think. It is set in an unnamed African country, which is modeled after maybe the politics of Rwanda or Uganda, I suppose. We have a country that has recently been liberated, and so we still have British colonialists who are occupying the country and helping to broker peace, because we have these two tribes that are warring. One is led by a president and one is led by a king, and the colonialists, who are no longer colonialists, they support one of them, and I can't remember which is which, the president or the king. But the one who has been supported, the one who has been touted as the ruler of the country, he is the person who has the majority support, and of course the backing and the support of the whites. But the other leader, he's on the run. At the center of this novel, we have two English characters, Bobby and Linda, who are on a road trip, moving from one safe location to another because of the natures of their job. They work with the government, they work with these officials who are here trying to maintain law and order. And as we see them moving across this African landscape, their conversation reflects their prejudices, their thoughts about Africans. Bobby is a homosexual. Linda is the wife of one of his co-workers who he doesn't really know very well, doesn't really like very well. But we see a lot in the conversation between these people about their ideas about the place where they've been living, what they came for, what are some of their preconceived notions, and how are some of those ideas reinforced or changed by their experience of being in Africa. And we also get to see the interaction that they have with other people, other whites that they meet on the trip, as well as Africans who some of them are trying to take advantage of them. And so we see the dangers and the conflicts that they encounter as they go on this road trip. But their experiences only mirror the now deposed king, as he also is on a trip, moving on a flight to safety, looking for refuge in a country that should have been his to rule, but now is a place where he's looking to hide, maybe hide for his life. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of that novella. In this country in Africa, there was a president and there was also a king. They belonged to different tribes. The enmity of the tribes was old, and with independence, their anxieties about one another became acute. The king and the president intrigued with the local representatives of white governments. The white men who were appealed to liked the king personally, but the president was stronger. The new army was wholly his, of his tribe, and the white men decided that the president was to be supported. So that at last, this weekend, the president was able to send his army against the king's people. That's the first paragraph of In a Free State. And it introduces a lot of what we know about the corruption of government support and how government support comes about and what are some of the effects that it has on a country when there are two warring factions, both of which could have been supported by outsiders, and what it means for the people who live in these countries. Fascinating book. And before I tell you my other thoughts, I'm going to tell you the final narrative because it begins and ends with this travel journal. And the last narrative, we return to journal entry style written by the unnamed, unidentified narrator from the first part of the book. He is returning to the Egyptian area. He's going back to Egypt sometime later. And this time he's going by plane. And because he's traveling over the holidays, he's forced to stop in Milan for some time. But arriving in Cairo, we get to see this clear difference between his experience in Milan and what his experience is in Egypt. How travelers are treated, how the locals are treated by foreigners. And I think it's summed up very well the journey that Naipaul took us through as we talked about freedom, as we talked about the freedom to move. And what is very different in the two journal entries is that at first we had that narrator experiencing prejudice being exerted from one group onto another group or onto a person, and not really saying or doing anything because he doesn't want to get involved. And finally, in this final journal entry, we see him experiencing some of the rage and finally speaking up for what he sees as discrimination, what he sees as prejudice, what he sees as people taking advantage of another group. And I found it very interesting to see the change that the narrator goes through. And while that narrator never identifies himself specifically to us, so we don't know whether there's anything from his ethnicity that makes him identify with one group more than another, maybe it's intentional so that we can experience the rage that he feels, just that any person being discriminated against. Feel along with this unnamed narrator the rage at violence, at discrimination, at prejudice. And while we cheer for when he speaks out and stops one bad situation, it also highlights the need for more of us to become involved and to speak out against discrimination and prejudice. I thought that was a really good way that the author chose to end this journey through the world as we looked at the search for freedom, the search for liberation, and what it meant that we saw people finally uniting or seeking to join forces with underrepresented people, seeing that they couldn't speak up for themselves. Here's one person who has decided he would also champion for the rights of others who were underrepresented or underserved. Rereading this book was a very different experience from the first time that I read it. I'm going to read to you my Goodreads review when I read this book last year. I didn't like it. I didn't like a lot of the things that I thought about it. But I'm going to read my review and then I'll explain to you why it's different the second time around. I wrote a lot about the plot of the book, but I'm just going to read my thoughts on the entire presentation. It said, I enjoyed the idea behind the stories much more than the experience of actually reading the book because there were several things that really bothered me. The author's choice to keep the characters unnamed for the most part and yet name the villains made it feel like the only way to escape anonymity was to become a notorious criminal. Especially in the title story, what felt like derogatory, stereotypical renderings of foreigners might have been novel modes of expression when the book was first published in 1971. But in 2018, it reeked. The constant reference to the smell of Africans, the almost constant accompaniment of fat Africans, was especially disturbing, as was the servile responses the author credits the natives with. I didn't like the constant references to Africans like they didn't belong, given that it was the narrator who was the foreigner. The way the author kept pointing them out as though they were unwanted blips on the landscape. Much of the narratives droned on for me as I frequently felt like I was pulled out of the story by the irritations previously mentioned. That was my Goodreads review on this book that I just lauded so much praise on this time around. Here's what's different. Last time I read it, I was thinking about what Naipaul was presenting and using that as a reflection of his personal biases, as a reflection of what he was saying, and really unfairly using the writer's words against him. Naipaul is not creating that conflict as an author, as a novelist. He's only reflecting what is. And in that first reading, I felt like he was perpetuating the stereotypes by using that language in this book. But he wasn't saying that those were his thoughts. He's just expressing what is. And so what I wrote about that book was really unfair. Just like I wouldn't blame a war correspondent or a photojournalist for bringing to me images of a war-torn area and showing to me graphic images of a person who'd been struck down by violence. It's not fair for me to put what Naipaul is presenting on him. And so I have to move away from that earlier review. I don't think I'm going to take it down because that was what I felt when I read it the first time. But this time, I'm telling you that I think this book is brilliant in what Naipaul brought to us. He brought to us a realistic view of what it's like as people move around the world and as cultures evolve with new ideas of freedom and new ways to try to search for it. I'm going to recommend this book. I'm recommending it highly. If you haven't read anything by Naipaul before, this might be a good place to start, because even though he is of Caribbean descent, he was born in Trinidad and went to England, I think as maybe late teens, early 20s on a scholarship, and lived there for most of his life. Quite a bit of his writing is set in his native Trinidad and explores the Caribbean lifestyle. This is very different from those other books, but his writing is something to be admired, something to be appreciated, something to study. And this time, I love the book. I'm recommending it to you. If you haven't read anything by V.S. Naipaul, maybe give this one a try. The stories are short, so they're easy to get into. And the theme of immigration, the theme of movement is a very popular one. So now you could probably read this and get immersed in his writing style and maybe fall in love with him as an author. So this is V.S. Naipaul's In a Free State, 1971 Man Booker Prize winner. I'd love to talk with you in the comments if you've read this one, or if you just want to laugh at me because of the about face that I've had to do in changing my reaction to the book and changing my review overall. I'd love to chat with you down there. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you want to see more. I've also included in the description box down below the playlist where I'm going to be reviewing all the books that have won the Man Booker Prize in its 51-year history. This is number 4 in that series. More videos to come soon, so follow the playlist so you can hear me talk about other books. Some of them are books that I've read already, and so there might be more instances of me changing my initial review as I reread those books. So I hope you'll join me for that. Let's talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.